Hi friends, and welcome to my little corner of the internet. I'm excited to go over some advanced techniques with you that can help take your hand lettering to the next level. All you truly need for this class is a pencil, so if that's all you brought today, don't feel bad about it at all. But feel free to grab whatever pens and markers you have laying around that you like using, because you'll be able to use these techniques with almost any tool. And that to me is the beauty of hand lettering. You can use almost any artistic tool to create hand-drawn letters, since we're not relying on a particular tool the way calligraphy or brush lettering would. Let's go ahead and get started on the worksheets that I made for you, whether you've printed them out and you're following along with the pencil or on your iPad. This isn't a basics class, so I'm not really going to be talking much about how each letter is constructed. Instead, we'll be focusing more on techniques that you can use to improve your lettering or to take it up a notch by putting it into fun shapes, adding some movement, or making it appear more 3D or dimensional on the paper. I'm going to be using the word learn to demonstrate both techniques that I'm going to talk about on this page, and you can feel free to follow along and do the same or choose your own word. Whenever I'm lettering, especially in a fun shape like this, I like to start out by drawing myself some extra guidelines. There's not much that's worse than starting lettering a word and by the time you get to the end of the page you realize you've run out of room. So I like to stop that before it even starts by drawing in my guidelines, which I've already done for you, and dividing it up into about how many letters I need. Don't forget to add spaces as well and allow a little more room for wider letters such as A if you're also drawing the word learn like I am. When you're lettering in a curved, pinched shape like this bow tie kind of thing we're doing, you need to take a couple of things into account. First, that whatever part of your letter is closest to the guidelines also needs to reflect that same kind of curve and shape. And this is why I'm drawing myself in some extra guidelines here that are a little bit separated from the baseline and the cap height. I just want to make sure that all my curves and swoops are going to be the same weight or thickness along the bottom and have the correct swoop that reflects the baseline. Secondly, if your shape is smaller on the right or on the left or in the middle, your letters need to be slightly smaller as well so that the relative weight doesn't look off balance. Weight kind of refers to the volume or thickness or however much space the letter takes up. And since the shape is smaller in the middle, we're just going to be making slight adjustments to the letters to make it truly look like it's being pinched in the middle. Now we can start sketching in our word. We don't have to worry about spacing since we took the time to figure that out in advance, and all you need to focus on at this point is spelling your word correctly and getting all the strokes of your letter roughly the same thickness as relative to each other, and then a little bit smaller, just shaving a tiny bit off as we go towards the middle. When you're sketching, don't forget to not dig too hard into the paper because you don't want to leave dents behind. I'm drawing a little heavier than I normally would just so that it'll show up for y'all since pencil tends to be a little light. We're making the top and bottom strokes of the E reflect whatever baseline or cap height that they're closest to, but the middle can be a little bit tricky. I chose to make mine pretty much straight, but you could make it curve a little bit out just so it reflects whatever line it's closest to. I'll let you make an informed artistic decision on that one. This is just what I did. Even though I'd done all my spacing earlier, I realized I didn't quite leave enough room for the R, so it ended up not being as wide as I wanted it to be, but that's okay. We're not going for perfection today. We're just talking a little bit about techniques that you can use in your future lettering and trying to get through a lot in one 30-minute lesson. So don't put a lot of pressure on yourself to be perfect today. Just have fun, follow along where you can, and you can keep the worksheets to print out again and again and learn at your leisure later. Something that can really help you visualize the weight of your letters to see if they're all relatively similar is to go ahead and color them in, even a little bit lightly. It really helps your eye see the little differences between everything when there's something more for it to look at than just the white paper. Another technique you can do to check to see how similar your strokes are to each other, especially when you're drawing them by hand like this, is to draw a circle in all of your different strokes. The circles should look to be about the same size between all your letters. Of course, this isn't going to be quite the same because we have the smaller letters in the middle going towards larger letters on the outside, but this is just a good way to kind of check your work and make any little adjustments that you need before we get into the inking stage. I'm not going to be inking in everything just for time's sake today, but I will go ahead and outline this and add those circles so you can see what I'm talking about. Our next shape is a flag shape, and this is when my camera decided to conveniently stop recording when I was going to show you this really cool kind of reverse contrast letter style. The key to achieving this kind of look is to already know which strokes of your high contrast lettering should be thick and thin, kind of like in a modern serif font, except I decided not to add serifs to this one. So it's just a contrasting font with thick and thin strokes. So if you already know which ones are supposed to be thick and heavy, you just flip those with the ones that are supposed to be thin and light, and you get a really interesting effect. I also use the same technique of keeping the strokes of my letters curved to fit the flag shaped baseline that we're using, but we didn't need to change the weight slightly because all of these letters are the same height. I made a little bit of an artistic choice here to use a lowercase a for this word in particular, just because I thought it would look kind of fun, and I was struggling a little bit to figure out how to do a reverse contrast uppercase A. So I went ahead and did this, and I also included a lowercase n, just so that my first lowercase letter looked a little bit intentional. When working on a trickier letter style or one that you've never done before, it's absolutely okay to use reference photos. You don't want to copy someone else's work or font exactly because that's someone else's work and you didn't come up with that, and that's kind of not cool. But what you can do is take inspiration from different places, whether it's old logos from the 1960s or maybe a cool bag of flour that you saw while you were at the store. Take little bits from that and use them as inspiration to create your own style of letters and lettering. You don't have to fill all of this now in if you don't want to. We don't really have a ton of time, so I'm just going to speed it up so that we can get on to the next technique. For our third technique, we're going to be lettering in kind of an arch. Trying to fit your letters into a curve is one thing, and into a really tight curve like an arch can be something else entirely. Arches have been everywhere lately in art and design and jewelry, so learning how to incorporate that shape into your lettering can be fun and trendy. I like to start with a ruler and mark the middle of the arch exactly, so I sort of have a vanishing point to work from. I'll then go and draw a lot of lines starting at that point and ending in the arch. These will be our extra guidelines and will help us space out our word that we're going to use today, which is the word creative. I'm using this word because I needed a bigger one to fit in this large arch and then in the pinched shape below. This is another place where you want to know the relative size of your letters and go ahead and mark out where you want them to fall in this arch. I'm leaving a little bit of extra space for wider letters such as the A and the V. Take your time with this to get it spaced out correctly before you start in the inking process. You can either keep the top and bottom of your letters normally straight and just rotate it a little bit on their axis to fit within this arch, or what you can do is use the technique we did on the last page and curve them just slightly to follow this curvy shape. Whatever look you're going for is up to you. Just make sure that you do it across all of the letters so that it looks intentional and not accidental. I couldn't decide which one to do, so I just ended up going with the curved lines. These letters definitely are not perfect, but that's not really the point of today. Like I mentioned, they are kind of fun and quirky and definitely look hand-drawn. If I'm going to critique myself a little bit and give myself some constructive criticism, I think I would move the A a little bit more to the left of the arch and give a little bit more space for the T and the I because it looks a tiny bit crowded by the TIV. And I'd maybe give myself a little bit more space in the R as well, but sometimes it doesn't always turn out exactly like it's in your head, and that's totally okay. You can always print out these worksheets and try again, or if you need to, put everything down and you can come back to it tomorrow. Now for this fun shape on the bottom that also has a vanishing point, but it's on the end this time, and it sort of looks like the letters are disappearing to the right. We're going to be using both techniques that we worked on in the previous page, where we both follow the angle of the cap height and baseline, which in this case, it's just at a straight angle instead of being in a curved shape. And we're also going to be varying the weight between all of the letters since they continuously get smaller and smaller. If we kept them all the same weight, the letters would not look the same from the first E to the second E. They can't both be the same thickness because they're getting smaller and smaller. You can use the same word that I'm using or a word of your choice. It's completely up to you. This is more about the technique in itself and the letter style and knowing what to do when you're confronted with shapes like this. Lettering in shapes can be a really great way to just take your lettering up a notch. I can't remember which artist said this, but they mentioned something about a road not always being in a straight line, or something like that the interesting roads are not the ones that just go straight. And you can also apply that to your lettering. You can add a lot of visual interest and reinforce whatever message you're trying to get across by incorporating shapes and movement like this. Let's get to know shadows a little bit. It is a truth universally acknowledged that shadows should and will appear on the opposite side of your light source. For example, if your light source is on the northeast side of your letters, the shadow should and will fall on the southwest side of your letters. I was going to start off with something easy like a drop line, but then realized that I made it way too far away from my letters and it just looked kind of weird. So instead, I thought, let's start with a drop shadow. You've probably heard the terms drop shadow and drop shade used interchangeably, and the way to tell the difference between the two, because they actually are different, think of it as if the letters are floating above a surface and casting a shadow, whereas drop shade, or sometimes called a closed shade, is closed at the corners. A drop shadow will not be. If you're not always sure where your shadows should end but want them to be even, you can use your ruler like I'm doing just to kind of draw guidelines. Our light source is at the upper right, so that means our shadow is going to fall at an angle to the left. Shadows can be quite tricky and confusing. They befuddled me for years. But what really helped me is to think about it in this way. You're essentially redrawing the exact same letters in a different place, right? Not all of that shadow letter is going to be visible, but if you just redraw the lines in a different place, you'll echo the shape and make it look as if the letters are kind of floating off the page. We're almost redrawing the same word, it's just a little bit offset, and usually it's going to be in a darker color or in a different texture just to further add the illusion that this is a 3D object on a 2D paper in a 2D setting. However you say it, that's what we're doing. Now we can get started on our drop line, which is actually a little bit easier than what you just did with the drop shadow. We're still doing those same offset lines, just echoing the shape of the letter. Just make sure it's a little bit to the left and a little bit lower. If you draw the drop line too far away like I did starting out, it's just going to look a little bit weird since it's so thin. And again, this does not have to be perfect, especially if it's your first time trying out shadows. Learning how to draw them takes time and practice. Now we can get started with drawing our closed shade. It's essentially the same as the drop shadow we did before, but the corners are closed, which means the shadow itself looks as if it's connecting to the letter above. If you want, you can start this by drawing 45-degree angles, since often that's where shadows are placed, on all the left edges of your letter. Don't forget the inner pieces as well, and be careful of any tricky curves. Placing shadows to the left is very common in lettering, and the reason behind this actually dates back to sign painting. When sign painters were working, they figured out that it took less strokes and therefore less time to actually paint the shadow to the left of the letter instead of the right side. You can of course place your shadows wherever you like. You could even put them above your letters if you want to. We're just doing them all to the left today so that you can clearly see the differences between the types of shadows. I'm trying to fit a lot of techniques into this lesson, so don't feel like you have to complete every single one in the same time that I am. This took hours to film and hours to edit. So again, don't worry about following along exactly and coloring everything in. Feel free to do as much of the technique as you can and finish the worksheets later on your own time. Now that you know how to do a drop shadow, let's draw it again, but we'll make it two-toned this time. What this is going to do is add even more life and more of that 3D effect to your letters. We're still considering our letters 3D objects at this point, so think of it as if the shadow is connected to the letters almost in a way as if it's a block. So it's a three-dimensional object, you're just looking at it at an angle. Our light source is still coming from the upper right, so we'll be drawing this drop shade to the left. And this is where you can pull out your different colored markers if you like, because we can differentiate the parts of the shadow that should be darker and lighter in a couple different ways. You can either color in the bottom parts of the shadow in one color but two shades, with the darker shade on the bottom and the lighter shade to the left, or you can do it in two completely different colors if you want to. If you still just have a gel pen or a pencil, you can differentiate the two by drawing in different patterns or textures. Typically, you want to put the darker color or the heavier texture or pattern to the bottom of the letter, and the lighter color or shade or texture or pattern to the left. It just tends to make more visual sense that way, but you can totally switch it up if you're feeling it. Also, I promise I don't normally draw this fast. It is sped up, so don't feel like you have to finish this during the class if you want to. Just try drawing in a letter or two and you can come back to it later. Now let's try an inner shadow. For this, you want to outline your letters, preferably in some sort of thick marker, or you can use whatever pencil or pen you're using just to make the outline thicker. We're still thinking of this as a 3D object, as if the outline was slightly raised and higher than the inner portion of the letter. Our light source is still coming from the upper right, so instead of drawing all the shadows past the letters on the left, what we'll be doing is acting as if the outline is blocking the light and it's casting a shadow inside of the letter. So it's still going to be to the left and bottom of the lines, but not the outside lines. Typically for something like this, you do want to use a fairly light shade, so I went with a gray brush pen because that made it really easy and it was light and soft. But again, you can use whatever you want, whatever you have lying around. It's time to draw a double shadow, and you should be familiar with it at this point, but we're going to be drawing the drop shade for a third time, or if you just don't want to do it at this point, you can practice this technique on the two-tone shadow that we've already drawn. Again, we're acting like the letters are connected to the shadow and the entire thing is a 3D object like a block. So if the letter and the shadow were connected in that way and were sitting on a surface, they might also cast a shadow. And if you want to do something like a double shadow, typically what's done is you add it in a very light color to the opposite side of your original shadow, which is a little confusing, but just go ahead and draw your drop shade to the left, color that in, and then at the opposite 45-degree angle, use that same light gray pen or whatever you use to draw in a secondary shadow. This adds even more of a 3D effect and makes your letters look even more dimensional. You're doing great so far, so let's keep building on what we've learned and draw a long shadow. This shadow might even be a little bit easier than the drop shade or drop shadow because the edges cascade off the end of the paper. So the only lines you really have to worry about are all the angled ones that are coming off the corners of the letters, similar to a drop shade. I'm going to trace a large box around this word, almost as if this is a YouTube thumbnail and this is the title screen, so that way we have an end point for the shadow to stop. From there, all that's left to do is go to the corners of your letters and draw that line just like we did for the drop shade at roughly a 45-degree angle until it meets the edge of our thumbnail. You've got a couple of options here when it comes to the bottom. You could draw in the bottom lines and do more of a two-toned long shadow if you wanted to for an extra dramatic effect, or you could just color all of this in one solid color. It'll still look really cool, it's just a little bit less work for you. The last type of shadow we're going to be working with is the one with a vanishing point. Just like when we were working on the arch before, you want to draw a center point below your word, and then just like we did with the drop shade, we're going to be connecting the edges of each letter to that point. Shadows like these can be rather hard to visualize, so I find that just taking a few seconds to draw in these guidelines really helps me draw them correctly. So using our vanishing point dot and the ruler made that really simple. We've got a lot of nice, clean, straight lines here. And all that's left to do is figure out which part of the shadow falls underneath the letter and which one falls to the side. Because like we learned earlier for the two-tone shadow, you kind of want the parts of the shadow that appear underneath the letter to usually be a little bit darker. And the ones that are to the left or the right in this case, because we've got the shadows being cast from both sides, to be a little bit lighter. The last technique we're going to be taking a look at is beveled letters. This is a really unique and popular look that you can add to your letters to make them look extra dimensional. You can of course add shadows and whatever you like to the background of this, but we've worked with that plenty today, so I'm just going to be working directly on top of the letters. It's a little bit hard to explain, but what you essentially want to do is start with an inline, which is just a line that divides every stroke of your letters in half. When you reach the connecting points of the strokes, you want to draw diagonal lines. It's a little hard to explain and can be tricky on letters that have angles like N, but just look closely at what I'm doing to help you understand where you should be placing all the lines to make these beveled letters. We're essentially making them another 3D object. So the middle point, or that inline I was talking about, is going to act like the highest point of our new 3D letter, and everything else angles away from that. Once you've got your inlines and other diagonal lines in place, you kind of want to make sure that you've got almost little triangles at the bottom, top, and at the ends of strokes, like on the bottom of the L. In the case of something like the crossbar on the A or the middle crossbar on the E, when it meets a connecting stroke, it also has a diagonal, but it doesn't have that additional facet. Again, it's a little hard to explain. Just look closely at the way I've decided to join each stroke and use that to apply that to other parts of letters that are similar or behave similarly. Now I'm going to go ahead and ink in all of the bevels so that you're better able to see kind of how this is supposed to look. Almost think of each stroke as a different piece and how they're fitting together. And again, that inline is sort of the highest point and everything else slopes away. Now is probably the moment you've been waiting for. You can grab those 4 markers from the supply list that's the same color in different shades or all in different colors, because we're going to be using these to color in the bevels, and it's really going to make your lettering look like it's popping off the page. One thing I did do to remind myself what goes where is to make a little chart. So since I've decided that the light source is coming from the very top, I want everything that's on the top of each letter to be the very lightest shade. So mark that with a 1, and you can do this too if this would help. Mark everything at the top with a 1. To the left, it's going to be a 3 for the third darkest shade. Put the second lightest shade to the right, and everything that's the darkest, or number 4, on the very bottom. Now all you have to do is color it in and watch the magic happen. You've really done an amazing job today, and I hope that you're super proud of yourself. I had fun hanging out with you, and I can't wait to hear what your favorite part of the class was, so make sure to find me on social media at The Greater Good, and Emmy and I will see y'all around the internet.